That's true, Dr. Zayas.
Very well.
Where would we be without THC? 'Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Yeah, where would we be without THC? The Higher Side Chat Show, Greg Carlwood and Company.
How's it going, Higherside Chatters? Drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke, and trying to chemically break consensus reality from my fragile mind. From sunny San Diego, I'm Greg Carlwood. And as you know, there are many aspects of history we don't understand and end up misinterpreting in the mainstream, but alternative and conspiratorial circles are just as guilty of mischaracterization. And the fact that we've been shoehorned into the monotheism and materialism paradigms might have a bigger effect on our reasoning than we even realize. While we might scoff at the cult of scientism, on another level, that box affects how we interpret odd data points in the past, and oftentimes our highly regarded fringe researchers end up putting it all in a physical, material context too, because that's all we really know. Even though in many cases we can still see that the pieces seem quite forced. Well, once again, the dark prince of modern chaos magic, Gordon White, has flown in on his proverbial broomstick to restore the magical and esoteric context necessary for reorganizing these very puzzle pieces into an arrangement that gets us a little bit closer to viewing the big picture. We talked about much of this in our last conversation about Gordon's new book, Star.Ships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, but unlike the vultures that circled around Göbekli Tepe thousands of years ago, we left a little too much meat on those bones. So diving right back into the deep end of the pool, Gordon, my man, welcome back to the higher side.
Gregory Carlwood, always a pleasure.
Agreed. And I've been talking to you about how in a lot of these interviews, you often don't get to that last section of the book, and that could be because hosts have a tendency to skim at an ever-increasing rate as they progress through a book, or maybe because some of the later revelations, I think, are even harder to really wrap your head around because they're so foreign to us. Things like understanding non-human logic and how these spirits tend to communicate with us. I mean, I still find it a bit slippery because our brains have been so well trained to not understand magic and non-physical things. So the first time we talked about this complex book of yours, I still found myself latching on to questions about the physical parts of it. Tell us about Göbekli Tepe. Tell us about Egypt. Tell us about the flood. The tangible things. But that's kind of what we're going to try to get away from as we get into the deeper stuff, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, in your defense, it's a fairly dense book. I think it's a breezy read. Obviously, please buy it. But it's also quite dense. So to kind of reposition how we have discussions about the extra-dimensional interaction with the human journey, you kind of have to tell, and it's a bit of an ambitious thing to do, but you kind of have to tell the whole story of mankind. So there's a great chunk of actual history that I think is fascinating that sort of front loads the book. And usually the interviews go through that because it's quite good. But in the last few chapters, it's really off to the races when it comes to attempting to model how these impacts may have shaped human history.
Yeah, well said. That is a great summary. And to grease these wheels up a bit, you talk about how the monotheistic and materialist viewpoints leave very little wiggle room when faced with things we consider esoteric or paranormal or things like psychic effects. All we're left with is flat-out denial. And as you say in the book, the impact of consciousness and psi effects have been scientifically observed for over a century. And maybe there's a disconnect there. Maybe we should elaborate on some of those studies that you find most valuable for people who still don't really accept or understand that there's something to it.
Well, sure. So at a macro level, there's the sort of opening words, or to paraphrase the opening words of Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, the human mind. I mean, he was saying that the most terrifying thing in the world is for the human mind to correlate all its contents, because it kind of allows you that intertextual perspective of mankind's sort of role in the cosmic food chain. Now, that's written for a horror short story, so it's potentially overly dramatic. Mm-hmm. But that inability to correlate contents or to consider things intertextually is a persistent challenge across all academic or intellectual fields. So it's no surprise that an archaeologist or a neuroscientist or whoever is unfamiliar with radical art history or consciousness and psi effects. And it's disappointing because if you can kind of look across different fields, you start to get a more holistic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, when it comes to consciousness and side effects over, say, the last 120 years, beginning with probably the research of the Society for Psychical Research in London in the Victorian era, and then moving through the sort of rise of parapsychology and the shadow state involvement with these kinds of phenomena and effects with the Stargate program and so on, you actually have genuinely a mountain of, in many cases, unfalsifiable or verified evidence, rather, in laboratory settings that demonstrate the peculiar effects of consciousness, human consciousness, and also what can actually engage with or influence it that's presumably outside the human remit. And when you consider that information in the light of, I guess, our interpretation of history, and in particular ancient history, when you have stories of cultures and societies saying flat out that the spirits taught them this, or the gods taught them this, we have, because of a failure to intertextually understand that information, we've kind of chalked that up to metaphor, or we've looked for a physical description of it. And that really surprises me, because in a very methodical and parsimonious way, we do have like actual scientific data that suggests that these kind of encounters are real in some sense, in some category of the word real.
Yeah, man. And a modern example of kind of one of these scientifically observed phenomenon, I think you've mentioned it in other interviews, but not the last one we did, but it would be Sony's inadvertent discoveries about apparently psychic effects. That might be a good example, right?
Yeah, sure. So Sony basically published a report that said, by the way, telepathy exists. And it's just simple as that, which, to be fair, they weren't the first to do it. And it was probably good PR in a sense. But when you consider what the sort of high volume of game testing, particularly for multiplayer games, involves, you actually are set up accidentally with a reasonably good sort of set of experimental parameters for discovering something like telepathy. If you consider how games testing actually progresses, you have people who are testing who are separated in time and space, or at least space, so they don't get to do the verbal cues or even the physical cues to demonstrate what their character is about to do in a game. And so you run this thousands and thousands of times, and you're monitoring it because that's the nature of games testing, in particular in those sort of multiplayer components where things may go wrong, that, you know, in a game, that's where you get the most bugs. So after sort of 18 months of games testing, Sony manages to release, just as a kind of offhand, presumably PR-related document, by the way, telepathy exists, and here are the statistical data for that as an experiment. And it is literally an experiment. I mean, they have statisticians and everything that are behind it, because that's what happens when you're a very large games company and you're testing the product that before you roll it out and make hundreds of millions from it. So that kind of thing tends to happen in a weird way in the private sector. And it's now at the point, I mean, Sony's kind of the cherry on the top of the psi cake, because now there's literally a mountain of data that supports some sort of consciousness field effects or psi effects information, to the point where I'm kind of past arguing it or trying to demonstrate by pointing to the research of Daryl Bem or, you know, Dean Radin or any of these people who've been doing this for decades in a lab setting with provable results. It's kind of up to you to get your head around it. And literally no one that I can see, with the possible exception of a researcher called Gregory Shushan, is doing that in the historical field. And that's genuinely a failing of science and inquiry, because we're not saying anything swivel-eyed here. This is information that's been available in the scientific public record for a century.
Right. Well said. And I guess as we try to repair this context that there is something to spiritual communication or information that might come out of the ether that's probably been glossed over or dismissed because we don't have the context for it, we should probably talk a little bit more about Egypt than we did last time. Because to quote the book, Egypt's reputation as the home of magic is as old as the country itself. Even during the dynastic era and throughout the Greek and Roman periods, Egypt was the undisputed originator and master of the magical arts. And that's a great quote, and I think people get that kind of, but definitely not the way a practicing magician probably gets it. Help us get a little closer to your understanding.
Well, sure. So the foundations of Western philosophy, if you take someone like Plato, would freely admit that Egypt was the home of mystics and magicians and wise men and wise women for the world. And it's basically been the last couple of centuries of Egyptology that have come up with the most moronic interpretations of Egyptian culture to suggest otherwise. But they've single-handedly failed to understand the symbolic nature of the different gods with the funny-shaped heads. They looked at it from this kind of antiquarian Anglican view of this sort of odd people with their bird-headed gods as somehow declined or not interested in philosophy, which is the most hilarious interpretation, particularly of the Old Kingdom, possible. John Anthony West, and I think he's right in saying this, says that Egypt is a one-issue civilization, and that issue is the survival of consciousness after death. They made games about how to do this in the New Kingdom. This is entirely how this sort of thing was built. So the reputation was there. And funnily enough, in Plato's case, you can, in fact, and in one of the researchers I rely on, Dr. Jeremy Nadler, does sort of say this, that a lot of these ancient Greek philosopher types said that they spent time in Egypt or they spent time in mystery schools in Egypt, and we've just ignored them going, well, no, that didn't happen. They made that up because, Egypt didn't have anything like that. And nevertheless, we take them seriously about everything else they say. So Egypt is and was considered, and we need to then take that seriously, the home of the inheritor of some very profound wisdom or information to do with the survival of the human after death. Even just the architecture of Egypt, particularly in the Old Kingdom, but actually this survives into the sort of promenades of the New Kingdom, and even into the late period when they started building temples to their hybrid gods. Without a sort of thorough understanding of, dare I say, quote unquote, how magic works, we kind of miss things. And the most stonking one, which you sort of briefly touched upon in the previous episode that we missed, is the flat out guess that the pyramids are some kind of pointy tombs, which doesn't actually fit in the rest of the history of kind of Old Kingdom Egyptian burial practices. But not only that, in particular, when you talk about Giza, you realize that this is an interrelated complex that has been in use for thousands of years and has been built up and has sort of had moderate or slightly changed use over the thousands of years. And also the folklore of this being a sacred place to do with the immortality or securing the immortality of a human survived right up into the period of Roman occupation of Egypt, where people, in 100 years ago, they were finding sort of hasty burials from the Roman period, so 3,200 years later, of people essentially throwing dear old grandma down a shaft, like an open shaft in the long-abandoned Giza complex. Now, that's an indication to us that this place retained its magic and its legend to do with securing this stellar immortality, because it's like, oh, what do we do? We're poor, grandma's dead, hopefully this will help, and you kind of throw it into the sort of sand-covered ruins of what Robert Boval calls a Cape Canaveral in stone.
And one thing we didn't talk about last time, which is also a fascinating part of the book, is the rises and falls of Alexandria. Of course, a sacred body of esoteric knowledge is always intriguing to a conspiracy guy, any way you slice it. But walk us through what you know of Alexandria.
Well, obviously, the city itself was named after Alexander the Great. So and he's Greek, and he invades Egypt and secures Egypt, and he puts one of his sort of chief lieutenants on the throne, Ptolemy. And so for 14 generations of Ptolemies, ending with Cleopatra herself, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt. Now, this is a very interesting time because they were aware, because of the reputation of Egypt, that they'd kind of landed on something pretty good here. And I think there's something behind this, the speculation of where, say, the Hermetic texts came from. There's no evidence, physical evidence for this, but it's quite a good case to make, that it was the Ptolemies themselves who sort of decreed that all the wisdom of Egypt needs to be translated into Greek. And so, I mean, Alexandria was the city where the Old Testament was translated into Greek for the first time. You had mystics and wizards and sort of out-of-work Egyptian priests and all these people wandering around bouncing ideas together. And Alexandria was kind of the New York of the time at its peak, because it was getting every map of the world. It was translating every single text. If your boat showed up in Alexandria, the officials, you might be from somewhere in Spain, or you might be from wherever, Lebanon. They will look at your books and they will look at your maps and they will make copies of them. And if you're lucky, you'll get the originals back. Otherwise, you'll get the copies and the originals go to the Great Library of Alexandria. So you have this space of cultural exploration and what we would consider scientific exploration and this kind of bouncing around and interaction of ideas like unto nothing the world had seen before. Like Alexandria is the birth city of the Western world in its good days. Mm. And we honestly, because of the terrible things that had happened to it over its history, it fell a couple of times. It fell to the Romans in 30 BC. It kind of kept its Greek thing going on. The Christian Greeks took it back a bit before 400 AD, and then they killed Hypatia, which there's a movie about. It's quite good. That's worth watching. She was sort of a prominent pagan philosopher, and then it eventually fell to the Arabs in 636 AD. So it's this amazing place that everyone wanted. And by the time the Arabs invaded, a couple of things happened. You have this wisdom tradition, or these memories of, say, the magic of Egypt and where Egypt's magic came from, bouncing around the Mediterranean like billiard balls. So a lot of them ended up in Byzantium, because Emperor Heraclius kind of fancied himself like a smart or cultured man, and he wanted to recreate the classical, or the high points of the classical age. So he sort of said, everyone come to Byzantium and you can all be philosophers and we can talk about this crap. The other thing that happened was, at the time, there was a sort of Islamic influence, and these words are actually there in the Quran, but there is an Islamic law around texts and sort of science and information where these things are valued. It doesn't matter where they're from. So there's an emphasis on education and the retaining of information. And we see, as the sort of Arab or Moorish empire spread along the coast of North Africa and up into Spain and then back into Arabia, that these ideas from Alexandria were spread and translated into other languages, and duplicate texts were showing up in Spain and in Iran and all these places. So it was not a happy invasion, but the invasion, with the benefit of hindsight, had some unintended positive consequences. By the same token, we have no idea what Alexandria would have become if it hadn't been invaded and collapsed in 636 AD. But that knocked the billiard balls of magic around the Mediterranean, and they kept bouncing for about another 500-600 years before we kind of get a bead on them again, as they show up in Venice in the form of the grimoires when Byzantium collapses.
Mm. And another quote I really like from your book that relates to what you just said is, combing through the Bible for muddled Kabbalistic insights will only yield so much magical utility. To yield maximum insight and utility, the mythology of the Near East must be viewed as a holistic spectrum. I like that a lot. Help us get there, man. What light does that perspective shed on things?
Okay, so there aren't that many incidents of monotheism around the world.
Right.
But where we do find it, it's sort of like a 2016 American election. There are several contenders for the sort of title of one true God. And you have a bunch of different people and politics and myths sort of spewing up. And eventually some of the detractors fade away and some of the wives fade away. And you kind of end up with one who becomes the one true God. And that's definitely the case. I mean, it's well and truly observed where Yahweh came from. Yahweh was essentially, with different names, part of an earlier Babylonian pantheon of other gods. And because of the various politics and so on at the time, the other contenders to be, president of the gods kind of faded away. Mm-hmm. Now, from a magical perspective, understanding that is quite good because it puts a lot of the magical practice that is associated with this particular monotheistic god in the context. So it's not a definitive description of this is how magic works. It's sort of a snapshot in the timeline. And we can sort of look backwards from that to see where other ideas came from that subsequently influenced it. And in particular in the Near East, it is their attitude to the stars and the planets and the sort of mythology to do with, say, Venus as the morning star who's sort of Inanna and also becomes Lucifer and what have you. You start to be able to put it in a context which makes – it doesn't invalidate the story of sort of a monotheistic god or using Kabbalistic magic or any of these things. It doesn't invalidate it. It does the opposite. It deepens it because it puts it in a continuum, which is sort of the whole point of Star.Ships. It puts it in a continuum of mankind's interaction with the spirit world rather than as this kind of standalone, I think this.
Yeah, and that's kind of the part that I've been able to wrap my head around a little bit better lately, but even talking about a body of like esoteric knowledge like Alexandria, conspiracy theorists tends to, again, put that in a physical context, like there's just a box of goodies that gets passed along through secret societies from the Knights Templar to the Masons and this and that. But I mean, I guess I just never really fully got out of that mindset and put it in the context of extracting knowledge from the ether or from the spirits. And we're going to get into a lot of good examples of that. And I guess the first one would be, to tie it into a discussion of Egypt, is Aleister Crowley. Can you talk to us about some of the threads that connect the two there?
Yeah, sure. So funnily enough, when we talk about, speaking of Crowley, when we talk about the realization that these spirits have been interacting with mankind, and we need to think about it in that way, because as you were saying, when you look at the survival of esoteric knowledge through time, you essentially have two routes, because it has survived, or at least it's recurred through time. And you either have the physical route, which is very tenuous from an archaeological evidence perspective.
Exactly.
Or you have, well, this is in some sense true, and thus each time the question is asked, or each time we respond or engage with the spirit world, this is what we get back. Now, Crowley was interesting because he had, and there's a whole chapter about it in the book, well, a subsection of it, but Crowley had several Egyptian experiences that he didn't have the archaeological context to interpret correctly that we do have today. And that's particularly interesting because the effects that happened didn't match what we knew of Egypt at the time, but certainly match what they do today. So, but, this kind of obsessed him, and we'll discuss the reception of the Book of the Law in a second. But funnily enough, this is an idea that sort of stuck with him his entire life, and he wrote about it in his old age a few times when he was in a retirement home near the south coast of England, and he would chat about it with Kenneth Grant, who was his secretary. But he actually wrote about it in his journals, and they've been published as Confessions of Aleister Crowley. And I've got a quote, because I was just working on a chapter for something else, which is absolutely on point, that I'm going to read now. He was doing this thing. He didn't like the Society for Psychical Research. He would bitch about them throughout his entire life because they're essentially competitors. But he was very interested in their research. So this quote is kind of on point. And Crowley wrote this. This is from his journals. I observe after a talk with Jules Courtier yesterday that all their SPR work is proof of extrahuman forces. We knew about them all along. The universe is full of obscure and subtle manifestations of energy. We are constantly advancing in our knowledge and control of them. Telekinesis is of the same order of nature as the Hertz rays or radium emanations. But what nobody before me has done is to prove the existence of extrahuman intelligence, and my magical record does this. I err in the interpretation, of course, but it is impossible to doubt that there is a somebody there, a somebody capable of combining events as a Napoleon forms his plan of campaign and possessed of powers unthinkably vast. So what Crowley's talking about there is something that we were talking about before we hit record on the show, Greg, which is that we can discern that there is sort of somebody else on the other end of the line by how odd the pattern of synchronicities that are associated with something is, something like this is, because you don't have... it doesn't obey the rules of human logic. It has non-human logic. And this is something that Crowley sort of realized in his old age, that whatever these he used the word extraterrestrial, but he meant it in a magical sense, which is above the earth. So a better word for that now is extra-dimensional. But we may discern that there is an extra-dimensional influence on mankind, or at least on the earth, by the weird odd alignments and the arranging of synchronicities. I mean, he used Napoleon planning a campaign as an example because he was the sort of super intelligent supervillain for the British even a century later, because it shows a masterwork of these weird interactions. Now, when it came to Egypt, he didn't have the archaeological evidence to hand because it's only been recent information comparatively. I mean, he died in 47. That demonstrates that the experiences he had by performing magic, he went to Egypt twice, sort of on his extended honeymoon, and the experiences he had whilst performing magic there, and in particular certain rites in the Great Pyramid, kind of had this cascade effect of weird synchronicities and the things that we would associate with UFO contactees. So odd atmospheric events and coincidences and repeating names and strange dreams and all these things. He had them as a result of sort of doing what turned out to be the precisely correct magical rite inside the Great Pyramid to kind of, quote unquote, switch on the spaceship. Now, what I mean by that is that the rite that he performed subsequent to receiving the Book of the Law, he called the Bornless Rite. Now, it's a ritual called the Headless Rite, or the Stele of Jew, as the short term for it. And it's a magical ritual in the Greek magical papyri, which means it was kind of kicking around Alexandria, although it was found in the kind of library of a wizard sort of further up the Nile in Thebes. But the Victorian magicians didn't like the idea of a headless rite. So they used a Hebrew word. They kind of used their dodgy white boy Kabbalah to change the word headless to bornless, because a bornless one sounds like some sort of, mystic god crap. However, it is definitively the headless rite, and it refers to Osiris. Like, I am Paphro Osirinophris is one of the lines, so I am the pharaoh Osiris. Osiris was famously dismembered, is associated with Orion, which is the kind of headless hunter constellation, and he performed this rite in what I think, and Robert Beval has made a very good case for, a giant stone map of the Orion constellation, which is, or at least the belt stars of it, which is the three main stars of the Giza complex. So he didn't know any of this stuff. He certainly didn't know about Göbekli Tepe, which is a star temple on a hill pointed at Orion with two kind of headless heavenly beings in the middle of the sort of main enclosures. And actually in Star.Ships, we go through the story of just quite how old this hunting headless association with the Orion constellation really is. Crowley knew none of this stuff. He accidentally, and this is metaphoric, obviously, he accidentally switched on the spaceship.
Yeah, man. A lot of what you said in that response is so key to what I hope people understand in this episode, because I think it's the biggest revelation for me is just non-human logic and how to identify it, because it's kind of like any language. Like, the more you hear a language, the better you can identify it. Even if you can't speak it, you can still hear something and be like, oh, that sounds like German, that sounds like French. And it's kind of the same with this non-human logic. The best way to really get it is by stacking up the examples of it, which is kind of what we probably are going to be doing for the rest of the show. So the picture becomes more clear. But yeah, that really is, to me, the biggest and latest revelation from your book. And I guess, can you maybe talk a little more about non-human logic and maybe try to define it a little better for people who aren't going to have any experience with it? Because a lot of people aren't.
Well, I actually think everyone out there does have experience with non-human logic. I just don't think they're using the right words for it.
Fair.
Because this is my issue with synchronicity, and it can be as simple as the most common form of telepathy, which is obviously the telephone or email telepathy. And people go, oh, that's a bit of a sync. I was just thinking about you and you rang. You go, well, fucking stop and describe that, okay? You can't without recourse to something really weird. Now, when you push that a little bit further, I mean, I'm known for some popular posts on Rune Soup to do with sigil magic that have been read a few million times, and it's kind of a beginning and ending of, well, not ending, but it's a comprehensive beginning to sigil magic. Now, if you do this, and bear in mind, as far as you're aware, all you're doing is drawing little squiggles and messing with your own unconscious. The way the results of something like this come through demonstrate quite clearly that you're not doing this, or at least not in a way that you currently perceive yourself, because you will end up with results that show up that couldn't work. So you'll get a delivery that will happen that must have left before you sort of shoaled the sigils, and then they show up the next day and you go, well, what's happening there? And the components of the hallmark of the evidence of non-human intelligence is this almost a lack of understanding of linear time or the human perception of time. That's the key hallmark of it. So one of the ones that I like, Crowley spent his entire life, because the book of the law told him that he was the prophet of the new eon. So he spent his entire life waiting to be kind of like a Krishnamurti figure, literally some sort of world teacher. That didn't happen. Nevertheless, if you look at the story of the 20th century, what you have is, and if you look at it from outside, so you're Iwas, you're the beings that are sort of beside time that are communicating with Crowley. He is the prophet of the new eon as far as they're concerned, because if it wasn't for Crowley, we wouldn't have the modern space age, because it was, his acolytes that invented solid state fuel. If you look at, name anyone else in the 20th century that's had a sort of more impactful relationship with rock music and sort of 70s independent Hollywood and everything else. So the kind of cornerstones of things that we would consider the 20th century, which is essentially the space race and rock music, there's Uncle Al sitting there in the background.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at it from the side, it's kind of like viewing, I perceive it as sort of viewing a vortex underwater, so like a sideways kind of vortex. As far as that, and Crowley's at the point at the narrowest part of the vortex. As far as the outside non-human intelligence is concerned, he is the prophet of the new eon, because the next 100 years were about space and rock music, and there he is. Mm-hmm. It didn't work out quite so well for him, but that's an indication that you're dealing with something. And he knew this by the end of his life. He knew that he was dealing with something that didn't think like a human, because it probably wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is so like what I'm kind of into today is identifying, because it isn't human. It is so foreign, identifying, the way it thinks and its type of logic. I guess searching for some type of analogy this morning for this kind of thing, it almost makes me think of the way communication is with like a 5-year-old, where they just hit you with all these non sequiturs, things that don't connect. Like if you ask a kid about their day, they'll be like, well, we went to the store and there was a man with a blue tie and then I got hungry, and like none of it really connects.
And then we saw a dog and then we had an ice cream.
Yeah.
True, if you're talking about maybe a super intelligent Aspie 5-year-old, because you will eventually discern the pattern of a 5-year-old's narrative. But there is a reason why I suspect probably the earliest god we had, according to which we discussed in the last episode, Dr. Witzel's sort of theories of constructing and sort of family treeing the world's mythologies. Mm-hmm. He rehypothecated what he thinks the earliest beliefs of humans were on Earth, and he called it the Pangaian belief system or Pangaean mythology. And there's sort of a distant creator god that has nothing to do with mankind, and we don't really do anything to do with him. But there is a civilizing trickster. So this creator god sends down some sort of civilizing being, but it's a trickster being.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially our first god is kind of like the devil, because the devil is the trickster in Western mythology. Now, the reason why I would put to you that it is the trickster that is at the base of this family tree is because just when you think you get a bead on it, it does something else. And that's why it has that form. Just when you think you've got it understood, it does something else. Now, across the sort of more spirit-friendly belief systems in the Western world, particularly the sort of Afro-Caribbean ones, you have the gatekeeper loa or gatekeeper spirits, and the ones associated with graveyards and portal places have a really dodgy sense of humor and are not necessarily hostile to mankind, but they just don't think like humans.
Yeah.
So that is an indication that whatever these cultures we're dealing with, they've kind of got a bead on it, which is we can understand it. We can kind of put it in a very large box. We can't put it in a very predictable box. We can put it in the box that says it's going to be unpredictable. Now, weirdly, I actually think, funnily enough, I was talking with Chris Knowles about this the other day. Weirdly, I think one of the reasons for the popularity of state-sponsored monotheism, say 1800 to 2200 years ago, is the promise of certainty. I think magic was banned because it was so disruptive.
Yeah.
It, like, on a cultural level, like, it's a really brave thing to kind of take full responsibility for your own consciousness, which is all magic is. That's literally what it is. And I think that's everyone's birthright. But it's not a predictable road. And I don't think you can build empires very successfully on unpredictable gods. And so you have to go with the ones who promise stability through suppression.
That makes sense. And another thing about the trickster, or to quote you about the trickster's interactions with us, you say that its knowledge seems to be designed to impress us with its slight superiority and inspire us in a certain direction. And I do think that's the best broad description that you can use to fit all these things into that you talk about in the book, and especially the emphasis on slight superiority. One example might be the story you tell from Jacques Vallée of an engineer who had a UFO experience in the 70s. Can you tell us about that and how it might be an example of that slight superiority?
Yeah, sure. I think it was the 60s, but it doesn't matter. Yeah. Anyway, this guy, classic abduction case. So on a camping trip, wanders off from his friends, vanishes for 12 days. And in that time, he didn't realize he was gone for 12 days, but he got picked up by a ship, or what he perceived to be an object, like the classic sort of transporter beam or tractor beam situation. And then he was sort of instantly dropped on a hilltop with what was a cutting edge computer for the 1960s, which was this enormous sort of 25-foot oblong tape winding giant sort of computer that you would have at the time. And this relayed a whole bunch of information to him. He was an engineering student. He was off with college friends. He returned, and it turns out it was 12 days later. His father worked in the military, so he'd quickly had like military people out looking for him. But he returned 12 days later, and his beard hadn't grown, and the sort of flower in his lapel, by the way, that's really camp, hadn't decayed or anything, even though he'd been gone for 12 days. So there's some very classic Travis Walton components to it. Mm-hmm. Now, if this is a physical alien, we are now more advanced than them just with our cell phones.
Right.
Because if this is the computer they bring, but it's not. I mean, you're dealing with an engineering student who needed to see cutting edge technology to have this information absorbed. Mm-hmm. And he got that in the form of this giant thing. God only knows, certainly wouldn't be my computer if he gets abducted again and is found on a hill. But you can kind of backcast this or forwardcast this through any number of these phenomena, because that, like, if you were to do that to Imhotep, the old kingdom architect who was responsible for the step pyramid, whatever, and I think he had an event like this, at least one, but whatever event he had, he's not going to be transported to a sand dune in the Sahara and see a 1960s supercomputer. He's going to see something else. Because it would be outside his frame of reference. He wouldn't get what this gray whirring box was.
Right.
And these phenomena dance at the edge of what we think of as possible, or more specifically, they present the things that they would like us to think is possible, and thus sort of human culture moves in that direction. And that's a very good description of what happened in the 20th century if you consider the space race with Star Trek and Aleister Crowley and all these other layers, and the UFO phenomenon and how it shifted at the end of the war to become what it was. And this is straight out of Jacques Vallée. I am a card-carrying Magonian when it comes to these interpretations. And his best book on this subject is Messengers of Deception. And when this came out, I've read his journals. When this came out, he was surprised. Usually he'd pissed off half the people. So he pissed off the nuts and bolts people or whatever. And this one, he pissed off everyone because looking at the data, you kind of have a control mechanism interpretation, but not in a way that where trapped in a prison. A control mechanism like a thermostat in a house is the example he used, yes, where it kind of heats and cools culture in a direction that we hope is benign, but the reality is we have no evidence for that being the case. And actually, if you look at how traditional cultures or traditional societies approach the spirit world, they're far more mature about it than we are, because they approach it with the necessary caution for what is an ambivalent realm. Some of the things in there are good, other ones aren't. And this kind of emerges from the fact that typically traditional societies are engaging with the natural landscape. So, there are sharks and tigers and what have you. And they appreciate there are good things out there and things that aren't necessarily bad, but things that are just a shark is going to shark. That's how it works. And they've sort of used this attitude to perceive the spirit world. And it's far more healthy, I think, than this beaming UFO cultists that we saw in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I definitely would say so. And I love that engineer example with the big computer, because it does speak to this phenomenon as being kind of illusionary in nature, or that this entity or being is presenting people with a context that they'd be familiar with. And that just shows, like, I don't know, such high level intelligence. Like, the game they're playing is just so nuts. And to take this back maybe to, you mentioned it parallels with Imhotep's experience, but to take it back further to a place like Göbekli Tepe, does it seem to you like the same spiritual information download is what's giving them knowledge of how to follow herds and hunt more effectively?
Yeah, potentially. I wouldn't say the same. I also would just kind of put speech marks around illusory, just because these phenomena present with very measurable physical effects, to the point that you'll find, radiation at impact sites and people will vanish and so on. So it's an illusion, but it's not, but it has a physical reality to it. We don't know how it works, but it does. So yes, going back to Göbekli Tepe, or just in general, hunter-gatherer cultures, if you're the shaman in charge of, well, not in charge of, but if you're the shaman associated with a particular tribal or hunting group, you eat when you can find the right spirits that will tell you which valley the deer are going to run down, and what mushrooms to give to the woman with having the troublesome pregnancy versus the ones that will kill her and her child. And there's kind of, although I'm not a Darwinian evolutionist, there's kind of a Darwinian evolution component to that, which is the tribes with the best magicians had the best lives. And this is the piece that I think people neglect, which we don't need to neglect now that we've kind of got this sort of scientific evidence that our human consciousness can do this, and these beings have some sort of reality. We have that over the last 120 years, and it's a case of backcasting it and thinking about what that might look like in a hunter-gatherer sense. Now, Göbekli Tepe presents a number of interesting options for how that might have transpired, because that corner, the hills sort of around Göbekli Tepe, are the origins of all modern wheat that we consume today, and it's kind of the origin of wheat cultivation. Interestingly, we didn't cultivate it for bread to start with; we cultivated it for beer, which suggests that we were aware that wheat could be turned into things like beer and bread, but we just couldn't be fucked. There's pistachios to eat, and there's deer to hunt, and what have you. And this grass, this einkorn wheat, if you leave it in water for a couple of weeks, it can get you a bit drunk. So that's probably worth our time. So you would have them gathering it for that, which suggests that we kind of knew, quote unquote, how to farm or how to garden. We just didn't do it because we didn't need to for a long time. And as to how that arose and how the kind of virus of civilization arose, I suspect the other end of the phone line had something to do with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear to me now. It makes a lot of sense. I guess to go back to Crowley and Aiwass a little bit, Aiwass was encountered in Cairo, apparently, in 1904. Do you consider the geography of that significant?
The geography of Cairo in particular?
Well, do you think he could have encountered Aiwass just as easily in Tampa, Florida?
Technically, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But also no. So it's not necessarily the spatial thing as much as it is the time. So if he had a jet, he could have had his experience in the Cairo Museum where he saw the stele of revealing, is what he called it, that had his 666 on it. And that was the kind of cornerstone synchronicity for him. If he'd had a jet and he'd managed to get to Florida or Melbourne or what have you, in theory, that could have happened. Aiwass came through to him in his interpretation out of sequence, because he'd achieved what he considered his knowledge and conversation with his holy guardian angel, which is the sort of apotheosis of the Abramelin operation, which he did when he was in his Golden Dawn days. And then the Aiwass thing happened, and so he kind of conflated Aiwass with his holy guardian angel. And then there were a string of synchronicities after that, after the reception of the Book of the Law. So he actually met a guy in New York who had Aiwass as a middle name, who helped him. I mean, the information is kind of wrong, but it helped him put Aiwass. He then decided Aiwass was a Sumerian god based on the information of this sort of Sam Jacobs guy with the middle name Aiwass that he met in New York, he told him about the Yazidis and how they were a kind of survivor race of the Sumerians, and so Aiwass is kind of like the devil and his holy guardian angel and this Sumerian god. So we had all these weird synchronicities because it's an odd name, and it is odd to meet a Kabbalist who knows a bit about your city culture in New York when you've been the person who's had an experience and you think your holy guardian angel is called that. So you kind of get to very long or very low probabilities when describing this, which again speaks to that non-human logic. Now, what I think he was trying to solve is at the time he was writing this, Sumeria was the oldest culture we knew for reasons discussed at the beginning of the book as to how the mid-20th century and early 20th century carved up history into chunks that it could measure. But when someone looks for the oldest thing, and Crowley did this and Kenneth Grant did this, it's because they're looking for an evidence match for the feeling of that experience, because it feels old, it feels eternal, and there was something about Aiwass and receiving the Book of the Law that Crowley knew was a very small part of a much larger story about mankind's relationship with these beings. So he was, funnily enough, Star.Ships is kind of in the same vein, because it is the quest for the first time this happened, because, and by the way, it doesn't get there, but the first time this happens is probably very important and very weird.
Hell yeah, it is. And who knows if we'll ever get there, but you've definitely made a worthy effort. And maybe this is a good time to bring this up, because of course I am bred and trained to try to categorize things in a neat little box, which of course a person's going to struggle to do with this kind of thing, just like you talked about, Crowley did too. But I sometimes hear it described as a hierarchy or family tree of beings of various densities, or even one big jumbled cloud of consciousness, or thirdly, sometimes as just a strange and deeper aspect of the self. And when I get out of my depth and listen to high-level magicians discuss it, they seem to come to that conclusion that it's some deeper aspect of the self eventually, which confuses me. But do you think this is one or the other, or a combination of all three explanations? What are your thoughts on this?
So the trouble with the deeper self description is that it's not really an explanation. It's just moving these things around. We don't know what the self is. We don't know what the unconscious is. We don't know what consciousness is. So if people feel safe, or if they feel more prepared to explore this sort of thing, and they consider, oh, it's fine, it's just the unconscious, or it's the imaginal realm, or I'm contacting my deep or higher self, go for it, because those words are all goo. We have no idea what's going on. Just to look at your other options, when you say a hierarchy, the sort of hierarchy approach of the spirit world emerged kind of at the end of the classical age, when the Christian apologists and early church fathers, particularly in this case Dionysius the Areopagite, kind of took the pagan world with all its spirits and all its gods and put them into this lattice structure between us on earth and kind of the sort of chthonic or underworld realms, and all the way up to heaven. And so you have all these different beings. So the hierarchy emerges from a kind of early Christian attempt to incorporate the pagan spirit world into the new regime, which is fine. However, the structure of it is an artifice that we have applied to it. I don't go, door number 3 was the one single consciousness idea. I don't go down that route either. I think the best way to look at it is to go back to an animist traditional society role of viewing it as a world, as a realm, as an ecosystem, which has some things, and it's kind of our job to find the ones that are interested in helping us and potentially things that we can do to help them and avoid the dicks. It's kind of like life.
Right.
And so for me, that seems to be the most appropriate, whether it's right or not is a secondary issue, but that seems to be the most appropriate model for understanding how some of these beings have an independent relationship and how some of them have an interdependent relationship. It's the ecosystem model.
Yeah. And I guess to expand on that a little bit, in your section, is it the Nuit formula, I guess? How to pronounce it, N-U-I-T? Yeah,
Nuit. It's the Egyptian language didn't have vowels. Well, obviously it did, but the translations from hieroglyphics. So Nuit is NT. So it's Nut or Nuit, or it doesn't matter.
Right on. Well, in that section, you describe a little portion of the entity hierarchy a bit, and I like how you say that she seems to be a step too far up the cosmological description of the universe to be quite as approachable to humans as, say, her children, because that is kind of a common idea in these types of spiritual hierarchies, that the higher up the ladder you go, the harder they are for the human mind to comprehend. It almost kind of parallels the way I've heard Lon Milo DeQuette describe the 4 worlds of the Kabbalah, if I had to stretch for an amateur comparison.
No, that one's all right. The other one I would use, you've had Dr. Farrell on before.
Yeah.
And he talks about the topological metaphor as his kind of sort of metaphysics of creation, and he comes from it from a very Eastern Orthodox view. It's quite good Platonic stuff. And he says the descent of the gods is the topological metaphor. So in the Laurasian mythologies that are discussed in the middle of the book, there is a sequence of creation where you sort of have a creator god, and then it goes through phases or generations of gods after that. Mm-hmm. And Egypt is no different. And Geber knew it. So Geber is her husband, are that. And the further up from humans you get, they start to become cosmic forces like gravity or something like that. They cease to become approachable as an individual consciousness and sort of blend or dissolve into the wider universe. And so in many ways, Nuit is an interesting goddess for Crowley to have received in the first book of the Book of the Law, which is definitively the best. He even admits that the third book is He probably lost the signal a bit there and doesn't like a lot of stuff in it. That's where all the Crowley detractors talk about all the bad shit that's in that. Like, he actually wrote it. He didn't. It was automatic writing, and even he didn't like book 3. Like, book 1 is the best. These are the communications from Nuit, the star goddess. And she's an odd person to come through, or an odd being to come through, because if you look at dynastic Egypt, she didn't have that many temples. She was depicted quite a lot. As the sort of overarching night sky, naked woman, body of the stars, kind of arching over things, particularly in sort of funerary stuff, like on the inside of coffins and so on. So she was obviously important as a force or a concept, but she wasn't worshipped in the same way that her children, Isis and Osiris and her grandchildren like Horus were worshipped as actual approachable gods. So that's kind of like the Jesus family, the Isis, Osiris, Horus bit. These are sort of approachable combinations. And it's odd because of what Nuit represents as our home to achieve our stellar immortality. Like, each night she swallows the sun and births it again. And if you look at the Old Kingdom texts, and even some of the New Kingdom ones, the sort of process of securing your stellar immortality essentially involves going through or returning to Nuit, and she is the stars. She is literally the heavenly sort of canopy above us. Now, if you're trying to explain something like Francis Crick's directed panspermia, which I remind everyone is literally the materialist scientists' explanation for how DNA got to Earth, like directed panspermia, a slimy rock shot at Earth. If you're trying to explain that to someone 30,000 years ago or to a Neanderthal, you're not going to use the double helix structure of the DNA, and you're not going to use all this kind of where we've tried to combine amino acids to create this and whatever. You're not going to do that. You're going to say your mother is the stars. This is where you go back to. Realizing that sort of secures your immortality. It's the very famous Terence McKenna thing, which is that the purpose of life is to familiarize oneself with the after-death state so that the process of dying doesn't come as a shock to the system, which I love as a line, and it's just a classic hymn. But if you're trying to explain that idea of mankind's stellar origins, which are probably a scientific fact, I believe they're an esoteric fact as well, you tell a story like that. You tell a story about Nuit, who's almost too diffuse as a concept to be approached as an individual being that can give you immortality in the same way Osiris or Jesus or someone can.
Man, so well said. And that makes so much sense. Another question to kind of clarify the Book of the Law and these channelings, would you consider this little saga to be a more recent incarnation of the Moses story or Hermes or the Thoth references? Does the Book of the Law have parallels to those situations and that material?
Yeah, sure. And moving forward, it has parallels with Betty and Barney Hill's abduction and all that kind of channeling UFO stuff that happened in the 60s and 70s. Moses is a difficult one. In theory, like, the Moses story is a description of a type of event, which is going up on a hill and having some kind of download. Right. Now, since the 70s, we've kind of known Moses didn't physically exist as a human person. That's a motif, just going back to that sort of presidential election view of where we get monotheism from. That's a motif that has survived or tumbled down into Judaism and Christianity from a much earlier time. Moses is the lawgiver type, and there's sort of a Manu and a Menez, and it doesn't matter. Like, there are a bunch of other cultures where you find a similar shape to the story. Mm-hmm. So it didn't physically happen to a guy called Moses, right? But yes, that there is a type. You find similar types of the sort of apocryphal beginnings of a number of grimoires as well, where people go up the hills and talk to a spirit or the devil, and you start to realize that it looks a lot like the ending of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Yeah. And we got to talk about the Sirius mystery at this point because I want to fit it into the free portion of the show, because I think this is another great little saga and a great little loop of this type of non-human logic. But to help with the understanding, you mentioned the Sirius mystery and its author, Robert Temple, as
a good example. Talk to us about this, because I think a lot of people will have heard of this, that it's been like debunked or it was a hoax, and maybe we should revisit it. Why shouldn't it be dismissed?
Yeah, so the thing about the Sirius mystery is that it's actually had the pleasure of having an entire book attempting to debunk it, but it's not a very good book. You kind of know your argument is on shaky ground when it relies on the testimony of a convicted murderer, which is Ira Einhorn, and its chief researcher, Phil Coppens, disavows it the second it comes out and writes on his own, which is still up. You can just Google Phil Coppens, The Stargate Conundrum, and writes his own kind of, actually, that's not what we were investigating. And part of the reason for this is that the Picknets were trying to, I perceive, drum up further support for their largely spurious idea that we get the idea of the Holy Family exclusively from the Egyptian Holy Family of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. There's certainly an influence there, but it's not how it works. And if you read Star.Ships, you'll realize that's the case. Now, the story of the Sirius Mysteries is quite interesting because Robert Temple was sort of like a student and friend of Arthur Young, who, I mean, you've had Peter Lavender on as well, which means you know that Arthur Young was at the seance that involved the Nine, and is kind of in that weird, very Lavender described matrix of, you know, Oswald and the Nine and elite families and so on. This doesn't appear to have had much of an impact on the Sirius mystery, other than that's where Robert Temple got the idea from a guy who's interested in, because he obviously believes in it, in the concept of extraterrestrial beings communicating with humans. And he used the example. He said there were these French anthropologists who went and studied the Dogon in the early 20th century, and the Dogon have descriptions of the Sirius star system, which at the time they couldn't have known, and a lot of the things that we actually didn't know in the early 20th century about. It's actually not a binary, well, it's a binary star system, but there's a third one called Sirius C that we consider, and they knew the relative masses of it, and all these other pieces, which you can't observe these things with the naked eye. Mm-hmm. So there's something going on there. And there's an additional layer to there's quite a few layers to their information. If you look at some of Laird Scranton's books, he points out that the Nomo, or some of the spirits of the Dogon pantheon, look like cells. They actually look like cells, and he thinks they appear to be sort of visual descriptions of things like cell division and DNA and chromosomes and so on. Now, this sort of information is not hugely useful to a West African agrarian culture. And so the interpretation that Little Green Man arrived from Sirius and said, "Hello, Dogon people. Let me give you some dumb factoids, trivia, if you will, about the different masses of our stars. And also, this is what a cell is. Goodbye," doesn't bear fruit. And that's actually not at all what Robert Temple was saying. He was, if you read the book, he kind of used that as the opening example of what extraplanetary contact might look like, or what the evidence for that would be. And it is what I call in Star.Ships, I call it redundant complexity. And there's quite a bit of it in Africa. So at Nubta Playa, it's not only the sort of Orion map that you would expect as a calendar, but the sort of different outlying stones from the sort of main clock, if you will, appear to have like astronomical information to do with the velocity of the stars, depending on their distance from the calendar circle. Now, again, that's information that cattle herders don't really need. And you kind of see, I view that as evidence of the non-human contact, because it's sort of information that's we've proved with science to be compelling, but it was useless to them. So they obviously got it. It means they got the download from someone, and used the pieces that they could, and the other pieces that they didn't. Now, why the Sirius mystery definitively hasn't been debunked? Well, at least nobody told the CIA it's been debunked.
Yeah.
Because if no one's read the Sirius mystery, you really need to get it, and specifically you need to get the re-release that happened in the 90s, because obviously the book came out in the 70s. So in the intro to the revised edition, he describes the persistent interest of the CIA in this manuscript, right up to the point that because he lives in the UK, he's American, but he's lived in the UK for, I think, 30, 40 years. He was actually on the set of 2001 when it was being shot out here. So there's this weird kind of nexus of, again, coincidences that make you think there's an unhuman intelligence kicking around. But the CIA stole his only copy of the English translation, which is called The Pale Fox, of that French anthropological study from the early 20th century that I was previously referred to. So the CIA came all the way to London to this nobody writer and stole a translation of, at that time, a 40-year-old anthropological study by the French in West Africa. That's odd. Mm-hmm. That's a very odd thing to do for something that's been debunked. And he sort of mentions in the re-release that there was actually CIA pushback. He discerned from his publishers in his attempt to get the second edition published in the 90s. There were other people who didn't want to touch it, and people who said yes and then vanished or wouldn't speak to him, and so on. So there is something about this book that has had people in the shadow state particularly interested. Now, in the 70s, of course, you're in the dying days of the quote-unquote public MK Ultra realm. The Stargate program is up and running, and they're encountering beings when they're doing the remote viewing exercises and so on. So there's quite clearly there's a desk somewhere in the CIA in the 70s that is aware that these phenomena have a reality that probably has strategic implications. And I think they hoovered that up because the Pale Fox, there weren't that many English translations of it, and I think they were looking for stuff to kind of follow along that lead. So it's a worthwhile book. I think Robert Temple's books on Egypt are the best as well. I think when you're talking about the constellation of sort of alternative historians, and if you want I think the best alternative historian view of Egypt, Temple stuff, he's a very diligent researcher, and he researches across multiple languages and so on. It's all very readable things, but that's my go-to. And his kind of defining book is the Sirius Mystery.
Yeah, I love that section of your book about the Sirius Mystery and the Dogon tribe, because as I'm starting to understand non-human logic better and starting to recognize the way it manifests, the way it shows up, it does seem like a great example. And when you're trying to discern what's a hoax and what isn't, I think the strength of its validity relies on the way that it fits that template. You know, it almost seems now to me more intuitively trustworthy. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And what I use it for, I don't think the Dogon have the secret of mankind's origins, right? But they are, because we have a reasonable kind of beginning and end point for their information, or for the information they received, we can use that as a model to look at other myths. And it's important, and I go into this in the book, but it's important to realize just how much of the traditional societies and traditional cultures' wisdom and myths are gone. And that's a result of imperialism, but it's also a result of the inexorable march of time. There may have been dozens of Göbekli Tepes across Eurasia, and it was just an accident of history that we ended up with it. So this is the intertextual thing that we opened the discussion by talking about, which is we have this sort of information we can verify about what I think extra-dimensional contact looks like in a traditional society sense, which is with the Dogon. And so we can take that framework and use it and sort of line it up next to Australian Aboriginal myths, or use it as an interpretive framework for Göbekli Tepe. And suddenly we have this key that can unlock interpretations of the distant past and the nature of kind of mankind's corner of the sky without necessarily resorting to physical aliens and making shit up.
Yeah. Well, my man, that pretty much does it for us. I'm so glad we followed up on this, because it all seems a little bit clearer to me, and I hope the audience too, although we did get into some of the deeper aspects of the book, I think.
No, it was a pleasure, as we were discussing beforehand, because it's a long book. I've been looking forward to this, because we sort of just started at the second last chapter and went from there instead of starting from the beginning. So I haven't really had this discussion yet. It's been an absolute pleasure. Nice.
And because, I mean, I agree. It really is fun, and it's the examples and the understanding of the non-human logic that makes that template easier to apply to things. And I think in the future, it'll make it easier for me to apply to strange things that pop up, like the Perry Reese map or the Dogon story. And I just don't think it clicked as well before. So that is another great reason to pick up Star.Ships. And now you also have a cheaper paperback version out, right?
Yeah, so both available at scarletimprint.com or your local Weirdo Emporium. It's not available on Amazon because the publishers don't do the Amazon thing. They do the independent bookseller thing, which is very noble. But, I mean, they'll ship anywhere in the world. It's fine. scarletimprint.com. Paperback is out. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, we got to call it in somewhere. Why not here? Thanks for sticking around for basically an extra hour. I mean, it's always a pleasure. And if there's any other information you want to give the people about the book or anything else you have going on before we really close it out?
No, this has been grand. A pleasure of a conversation. If people liked it, get Star.Ships, and as Greg will attest, a second read through, and suddenly it's a new way of seeing things.
Well, Gordon, you are the man. Take care out there. Keep doing what you do.
Will do.
Boom, people. There we have it. Always a pleasure to have Gordon here. Big thanks to him. We recorded for nearly a full 3 hours, but we were having a whole lot of issues with Skype. So in the end, it was just over 2.5. But I'm glad we revisited the topic so soon and got past some of the intro to Star.Ships stuff, which is great, of course. But I think we got into the deeper aspects of what a history lesson from a magical context can shed light on. And sometimes I get a bit tongue-tied talking about this stuff and trying not to stray back into conventional paranormal conspiratorial language because it's just not something I hear every day. And it's not going to be because this is unfamiliar territory for a lot of people. This is door number 3 that remains firmly locked in our culture. But I do hope you enjoyed these stories and examples of such interactions, and maybe the templates become a little more clear for you as it has me. It's obviously not a master key to understanding everything that's weird about the past and present and future. It's doubtful we'll ever really recover that key. We don't even understand consciousness exactly, how time works, how multiple dimensions work, what these intelligences are. But I think I have slightly better labels on the boxes that I can put things in after today. And I learned a lot, more so than on some other shows. I think Gordon reading Crowley's quote about how this intelligence can create these matrices of names and dates and events like Napoleon compiles his plans for war, there's definitely something there, and I love exploring it. I think it might be a better explanation for the examples we tend to call predictive programming, or maybe the elite do know how to weaponize mass consciousness to play out events, but even as I was editing this show, obviously, Egypt played a large role in the discussion. I was thinking back about last week's show on education and some of the guys that set it up. Do you remember the name of the main player? His name was Horace Mann. I mean, what does that mean? Maybe nothing, probably nothing. But a guy's name is Horace Mann, not Horace Manningley or Horatio Mann or even Horace Smith. I mean, specifically Horace Mann. It's a little odd. And just to quote Wikipedia and historian Elwood P. Cubberley, no one did more than Horace Mann to establish in the minds of the American people the conception that education should be universal, free, and that its aim should be social efficiency, civic virtue, and character. Now, we might use a little different language for that agenda, but in the modern era's largest empire for the last 100+ years, our system has churned out obedient workers and perma-children, and nobody did more to sell it than Horace Mann. Maybe I'm just going a bit nuts and getting paranoid, but another strange thing I saw this week was another reality captured in a previous episode of The Simpsons, which is already proven to be a vehicle for future predictions, alluding to not only 9/11, but also several other false flags in the past. And again, I don't know why, but you can clearly see it. There was another one this week in a previous episode of The Simpsons that aired 16 years ago, apparently, where Trump ran for president. Now, that's not too strange. He's always been a public figure, and The Simpsons like to point fun at these kinds of people. But there's a scene where he's coming down an escalator with a crowd cheering, and they're holding signs, and in the animation, one person up against the glass drops her sign. Not a huge deal, but fast forward to this current election cycle and you can see some footage that mirrors that Simpsons scene almost exactly. Secret Service is standing in the same area where they are in the animation, the crowd is in the right place, and if that wasn't enough, someone drops their sign just like it shows, as if they were trying to film a live-action representation of that very scene animated 16 years ago. How does this happen? I mean, we're not supposed to really think that the CIA had planted someone against that rail and gave them the, okay, drop the sign signal in their earpiece, right? Probably not. But a lot of people do think the elite would have set up that scene. I doubt that. But why does Simpsons, the longest running TV show I think ever, have such a high success rate with depicting future events? I mean, Family Guy did it a couple times too. Maybe some of these writers are practicing magic in their spare time, or maybe some trickster entity has latched onto that writer's room, feeding ideas into the minds of unsuspecting creatives in a muse-like fashion unbeknownst to them. Maybe the Simpsons writing room was built on an old burial mound. Who the hell knows? But you should look up that example because it's too close to be coincidence. I don't know what my point was really, because I still don't understand that stuff. But we should look to studies of the morphogenic field, psi effects and consciousness, or magic and interdimensional influence before thinking that it was inserted by the elite for some reason. Not that we all think that, but we know that there are guests and researchers who point to those predictive programming examples as being a tool of the elite. And I think that's the best answer you can come up with when you don't open up this door number 3. I guess that's all. That's my point. The world is a weird place, and it's not that we haven't been born into a Rockefeller-Rothschild system of control and energy extraction generations in the making. I think an honest examination of the institution of the educational system and the alcohol prohibition conspiracy and textile industry's attack on hemp and marijuana, the war on drugs, the fractional reserve banking system, the for-profit prison system, and all the other down-to-earth metaphorical weights on society placed there by the titans of industry and the great blue blood philanthropists of the Western world will show us that to a large extent we have. It's just that everything doesn't fit in that box. There are others, and I think sometimes we give even the richest shadowy figures a bit too much power. And even though I've grown accustomed to calling them puppet masters, maybe they're a bit closer than we realize to being puppets in the great big play we call the physical plane. Who knows? But this is one of my favorite shows in a while. The second half is great too. You know you'll love it. Sign up for THC Plus if you haven't already. Not only is this Plus show longer than most, but we also talked about a lot of awesome stuff. We got deeper into the understanding of non-human logic, some ayahuasca examples, how things like the Perry-Reese map fit in, remote viewers, AI communicating with Uri Geller backwards through time, what could have been if magic and science had been allowed to work in conjunction in a mainstream way over the years. We also talked about some questions from a couple of the Plus members. And as far as communication with these entities go, we talked about entheogenic communication versus a sober ritualistic one, how they differ, profiles on some individual entities like Astaroth, and how this communication occurs on a personal level, and what Gordon called interdimensional diplomacy. All great stuff, and I put so much of those memberships back into the production of the show, whether it's better equipment, or editing, or the music, or making the website better, and paying for higher bandwidth, and all that good stuff. So the next thing on my list is show notes. I was lucky enough to have a listener put together an iPhone app for us, and that should be hitting the Apple Store in the next 48 hours, and that's a beautiful thing. But so many people have asked about better show notes, where we could put in reference links to things and people mentioned in the show, because I know how hard it is to go back and try to find something that you want to pull out. But they have services for this, and the next thing on my plate is to get that for you guys. I think it would be a win-win, because I could definitely use it, you guys could definitely use it, and it helps with the show's SEO as well. But it's another cost, and if we could just get about 50 new members, I could afford to do it monthly, and maybe even go back to previous shows and institute it. So just know you get a lot more show for your $5 a month, and you can trust that I'm going to try to make it better every step of the way. We also have the Money Bomb. Don't forget the Money Bomb. The 5th show of every month, I give half of the donations back to a random listener. It's made a lot of difference for certain people who aren't getting a fair shake. I'm also going to be doing something different with conspiracies pretty soon, and I need to clear out all the shirts that I have to store at the house and send out personally, because, you know, you got to get away from that if you're going to go big time. So prepare for a big sale there. probably before the next show is up. But anyway, I did really like this one. Big thanks to Gordon for writing the book and always being willing to educate this dumb stoner on pretty much everything. And that's it for me this week. Your move, interdimensional sync sorcerers and weavers of reality. Your fucking move.
Woke up this morning with light in my eyes, and then realized it was dark outside. It was a light coming down from the sky. I don't know who or why. Must be those strangers that come every night, whose saucer-shaped light put people uptight. Leave blue-green footprints that glow in the dark. I hope they get home alright. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along? I won't do anything wrong. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along the high side? Woke up this morning, I was feeling quite weird. I had flies in my beard, my toothpaste was smeared. I opened my window, they'd written my name. Said, so long, we'll see you again. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along? I won't do anything wrong. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along the high side? Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along? I won't do anything wrong. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along the high side? Won't you please take me along the high side?